Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Neil Howard. In this segment, we're going to be speaking with Stan Abel. He's CEO of ProJenX. It's the company that's leading the way in the development of targeted therapies to address significant unmet medical needs in degenerative brain diseases, with a special focus on ALS. He's joining us to talk about the phase 1 clinical study of Prosetin in healthy volunteers and people with ALS. Thank you so much for joining us here, Stan.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate the invitation to join you.
Well, as CEO of ProJenX, give us a brief look into your professional background and talk about your role at ProJenX.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have a business and finance background, so I often reflect on having spent the majority of my career in either big pharma or small venture capital funded biotech companies. That it's been an incredibly rewarding journey to be able to work with some of the amazing researchers and scientists along the way, including and especially the group of people I'm working with now at ProJenX. So it's been a very rewarding career for someone with a business and finance background.
Although you have a focus on ALS, that is not the only brain condition that you are studying there.
That is correct. The background of the company, it was really driven by a passion to pursue therapeutics for ALS. And just real briefly, the company actually has evolved from a long-term research collaboration between Project ALS, which is a not-for-profit organization supporting research activities and patient advocacy, and researchers at Columbia University. And again, over a period of 20 years, there's been some amazing scientific breakthroughs that have led to specific cell-based screening platforms to look for drugs that could be effective in people living with ALS. That's how we discovered Prosetin. And along the way, in understanding Prosetin and how it interacted with our biological target of interest, which is called MAT4K, we also learned that it could have potential given its neuroprotective effects, could have potential in other neurodegenerative diseases in addition to ALS. So we're looking at Parkinson's disease, we're looking at Alzheimer's, but clearly the initial focus and the subject of the current clinical trial is for ALS.
Give us a brief look into what ALS is and some of the challenges that exist in developing treatments for the condition.
Yes, ALS is an abbreviation for Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis. It's also commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease, after the famous baseball player that was diagnosed with the condition back in 1939, I believe. ALS is a devastating, progressive neurodegenerative disease that affects nerve cells known as motor neurons. And motor neurons are responsible for the ability of the brain to communicate with all of the muscle control and movement throughout the rest of the body. So in ALS, these motor neurons slowly start to die initially, and then it progresses more rapidly. And as these motor neurons die, it basically interrupts the ability for the brain to communicate with the muscles throughout the body. And over time, people living with ALS will lose the ability to speak, eat, move, and even breathe. So sadly, ALS is considered a universally fatal disease within 2 to 5 years. And it's been a challenging area to develop effective drugs. There are only 2 drugs currently approved for ALS, and they offer very modest clinical benefit over really a few months at best. So there remains an extreme unmet need to develop new therapies to help alter the progression of the disease, slow the progression of the disease, hopefully, and improve the quality of life for people living with ALS.
Now, Prosetin is on track to basically initiate a phase 2/3 study next year. Talk about Prosetin and the results of this first study.
Yes, thank you. So Prosetin is unique in this context of ALS because it was developed over that 20-year period. The science that led to Prosetin was specifically looking at ALS cell biology and looking for targets that our team knew would be neuroprotective. In other words, delay the decline in motor neurons and preserve motor neurons and increase their survival. So there's a large body of preclinical, or what we call non-clinical, early stage research that supports Prosetin as having really, really robust neuroprotective effects. Then, according to the process, we put together what's known as an IND package, or IND Investigational New Drug Application, to FDA. And then we were able to initiate phase 1 clinical trials. Phase 1 is typically intended to assess initial safety of a new compound or a new drug candidate. And we have completed one portion of the phase 1 trial, and currently in the midst of a segment of the phase 1 trial. And our plans are to initiate a third section in ALS patients specifically later this year. ALS is an orphan indication. It's considered a rare disease. So we have the opportunity next year to initiate a phase 2/3 trial that could support the ultimate registration of the drug. So we would run that trial. It would take a couple of years to enroll it. And if the trial is successful, we would put together an NDA application to submit to the FDA, and hopefully, this drug could be available to people living with ALS in late 2025 or 2026.
Now, I understand that the phase 1 included both healthy candidates and people who actually had ALS. Is that correct?
So the healthy volunteers portion is currently ongoing. And the ALS segment of the phase 1 trial is scheduled to complete by the end of the year.
What's next for ProJenX?
Always in the life of a early stage venture capital funded biotech company, we spend a lot of our time raising capital, raising the investment dollars required to advance our drug candidates. And, as most people are probably aware, and the drug development process is long and it can be quite expensive, and, requiring tens of millions of dollars, if not eventually hundreds of millions of dollars to complete the development process for these drug candidates. So in addition to focusing on advancing Prosetin and completing our phase 1 trial successfully, we are embarking on a Series A fundraising effort targeting $40 million that we hope to close within the next 6 months or so, that would allow us to complete that phase 2/3 registration trial for Prosetin in people living with ALS.
Well, give us a website, if you would, where our listeners can learn more about ProJenX.
Yes, thank you. It's www.projenx.com. ProJenX is ProJenX.com.
Stan, I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much for joining us here on Health Professional Radio.
Neil, thank you very much for having us.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Stan Abel, CEO of ProJenX. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.